Okay, this is Professor Hazara again, and this is the final of my self-produced videos for the class 504 class. This one's going to be on leverage. We usually cover this a little more extensively than we're going to cover it this time, but due to circumstances, can't cover it this time. And there's going to be 3 videos. First video, I'm just going to talk about some of the basic concepts. In the second video, I'm going to do some valuation of Eli Lilly, a relatively levered firm, but I'm going to assume that the firm doesn't grow. And in the final video, I'm going to add some growth to that valuation. And we're going to consider throughout this whole series of videos, we're going to focus on debt. Okay, so this video we're going to talk about concepts, and I'll start the worksheet too. Let's go to this little sheet here that says concepts. Okay, now there's 2 concepts that are very important here. The first one is the value of leverage. And you could say, actually, in a sense, you could say the value of debt. Does debt have any value? Okay, now here I've mentioned a 1950s article down here by Modigliani and Miller, always known as, sort of commonly known as M&M. The Modigliani and Miller theory, let's say. I'm sure it's more complex than this, but this is the idea. Let's say you have 2 companies. You have 2 companies. Company A here has assets of 100,000 and common stock of 100,000. So Company A is an unlevered firm. It has no debt. Okay, and let's say that you have Company B. Now, Company B is identical on the asset side to Company A. So Company B has, let's say that it has the same amount of assets, and let's say also that it has the same mixture of assets. Let's say the assets are identical twin assets. And also let's assume that Company B, that the management talent in Company B is exactly as Company A. Okay, and so on the asset side and on the management of the assets, in the management of the assets, the companies are identical. That's what I'm saying here. The companies are identical on the asset side, but not on the capital side. Okay, so they're identical on the asset side, but not on the capital side. And what do I mean by that? It's the manner in which the assets are financed. Company A is financed all through common stock, totally through common stock. Company B is financed 60% with long-term debt and 60% with and 40% with common stock. So even though the assets are identical, the managements are identical, maybe they're identical twins, and the talent is identical, the firms are identical on the asset side, but the manner in which those assets are finance is different. Company A is unlevered, it has no common stock. Company B is levered because it has 60% of its financing coming from long-term debt. Okay, now here's what Modigliani and Miller said in their 1950 article. Here's the main point, that when you value 2 identical firms, in this case on the asset side, when 2 firms are identical on the asset side, the value, the mixture of their capital, the degree to which they're financed through common stock or through a mixture of common stock and long-term debt, should be irrelevant in the value of the firms. Otherwise, what they're saying is that really what matters in the valuation of the firm is the assets and how well they're managed. How they're financed, according to their theory, should be irrelevant. Okay, and the theory is very logical, and sometimes I go over the basics of it in class. Don't have time this time. Okay, now what happened was, and I believe in the theory. I'm a big believer that that management of assets and the assets, that the firm's assets and their management are what matters. To me, that's what matters. That's why I think I always, when I do valuations, I always like to take assets and then subtract out debt, which is what I'm going to do eventually in this example in the 3rd video here. There's 3 short videos here. So I like to look at the asset of a firm. You know, with all due respect to finance people, how they're financed, it's important, but to me it's secondary. It's really their assets and how they're managed. Okay, and that's what these two gentlemen said. It's the financing mix is irrelevant. It's the assets that matter. Okay, but they did modify their theory. They came to the conclusion in a subsequent paper. I don't know exactly where it is, but they came to a conclusion, and they came up with what is called the modified M and M theory. And the modified M and M theory did recognize some value in debt. The original theory said debt doesn't matter. There's no value to it. It's the mixture of your capital doesn't matter. So debt has no impact on the valuation, ultimate value of the firm. But in their second theory, what they did was they recognized one small item that they hadn't recognized in their original article, was that interest is tax deductible, the tax shield. Okay, so they did come to the conclusion that debt does have some value in valuation, but that value lies in the tax deductibility of interest. And that's what the tax shield that we talked about in the one or two examples, a couple examples that we did in capital budgeting. Okay, and so basically this stuff's pretty old, but it's still very highly cited. Okay, so that's the first concept. And so the first concept is basically that firms, if you have two identical firms, their financing mix is irrelevant. What counts is the assets and management of assets is what distinguishes the value of firms. Okay? And although there is a slight modification to recognize that debt is tax deductible and therefore has a tax valuation, the tax shield has value. Okay, so that's the first concept. In the second concept, this is a very important concept, one that I usually talk about a little bit earlier than this part of the firm, but for obvious reasons I haven't had time to do that, is I want to distinguish between two types of terminal valuation. Okay, throughout the class, we've been using what is called constant growth valuation, terminal valuation. And that's, we assume that a company goes through a super growth period, and then after 5 or 6 years, whatever, its products mature, and it goes into what we call a constant growth phase that we're assuming goes on forever. And the formula that we've been using in class, this is the formula we've been using in class. I think some people call it the Gordon growth model, the Gordon constant growth model. But basically, it's the valuation we've always been using. If you take the cash flow, any cash flow today, to get the value of the cash flow of a constant growth cash flow today, take the cash flow today, take it out one period, and divide it by the cost of capital less the growth rate. Okay, now there is another formula which is actually simpler, and you can actually figure this out. You could do this using basic algebra, basically, a little bit of calculus with limits or something, but it's in a lot of textbooks. But there's also something called the no-growth formula. And the no-growth formula basically is the same concept as the constant growth formula, but the no-growth formula places a value on a cash flow that goes on forever, but that doesn't grow in perpetuity. So it could be a dividend, it could be that doesn't grow, it could be an interest payment that doesn't grow, it could be some sort of free cash flow that doesn't grow. But if you have a situation where you have a firm that's not growing, which for our purposes has been depreciation is equal to capital expenditures. So if you assume that a firm is not growing, then if you just take the cash flow, and it doesn't matter whether it's today or 1 year from now, because it doesn't grow, it's the same every year, and divide by the no growth cost of capital, what you're going to get is the value of a cash flow that grows forever, but a cash flow that does not grow. Cash flow in perpetuity that does not grow. Okay, so keep this formula in mind. Now, this formula is not very practical, really, but it can be used sort of to facilitate some of the concepts in valuation. And what I'm going to do here is very basic, but I like it sometimes because you can use it to calibrate a model, and then so you can make a model assuming no growth, and then add growth to it, which is what I'm going to do in the next two videos. After this one here, I'm going to just sort of finish the concepts here, do a little bit of cash flow calculation in the next worksheet, and then we'll go on to the video where I do assume evaluation using a no growth formula. Then we'll tack on some growth, and we'll consider the level of debt throughout these examples. Okay, so let's see what the financial statements that you're going to be looking at, because you're going to have to replicate what I do here. Okay, now these financial statements, I'm showing my age here. It was like just yesterday, but these are financial statements for Eli Lilly and Company. And I chose this one. I've got a bunch of worksheets, obviously. I chose this one because it's a drug company, and who knows, they may be back in the news with what's going on in the world nowadays. Okay, so anyway, we've got the years 2000, 2001, 2002. Okay, and their income statements are right here. Okay, so you got, these are their actual income statements. The ratios are out here, but I generally won't be using their ratios here. Notice that, by the way, that they have, the only, I think, number I use from the ratios, they have a 22% tax rate here. Okay, and so you got their income statements, their balance sheets. There's their balance sheets, fairly long balance sheet there, treasury stock there, and their statement of cash flows. Okay, now what I'm going to do is just, I'm sort of going to get started. I'm just going to do a preliminary calculation of the free cash flow here, and that's kind of another concept. And then I'll leave off, and then we'll continue with the actual no growth valuation in the next video. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do a calculation of the free cash flow. But now, since we're considering debt, we're not just going to consider free cash flow to the firm. We're also going to consider a level of cash flow called free cash flow to equity. Okay, so let me put up, what I'm going to do is put up the line items, and then I'll go ahead and show you where I get the numbers from, which isn't hard. Most of them come from statement of cash flow. Okay, so let's start with income. First of all, this is cash flow calculation. Okay, so let's start with income from operations, which is basically your pre-interest income. That's going to be your pre-interest income. And we're going to add back, so we're going to go ahead and add back the interest expense net of taxes. So we'll do that, add that back, and there's a line there, give us a subtotal. So let's put subtotal here. Okay. In a sense, that's your income before interest. Okay, then we're going to do the usual free cash flow routine. We're going to take out minus, so we're going to take out minus increase in working capital. We're going to add back depreciation expense. Oops. Add back depreciation expense. And then I'm going to take out capital expenditures. Let's put capital expenditure there. And that's going to give me my free cash flow to the firm. Now, this is an important concept here because we're going to have two levels of free cash flow. What we've been using in the class is free cash flow to the firm. Okay, and free cash flow to the firm is the cash flow that is available to pay, is the cash flow after you're meeting your growth needs, there's your capital expenditures, that's available to pay both interest and dividends. In a way, it's kind of goes in hand with return on assets, return on to all investors. This is the cash flow which is available to both creditors, interest, and stockholders of dividends. But what we're going to do is we're going to take out, it's going to be the same numbers I put up here. What I'm going to do is, after I calculate my free cash flow to the firm, which is the appropriate level of cash flow to calculate the value of assets, if I take out my interest, I might go ahead and take out the number I subtracted up, I added back initially, interest expense net of taxes. That should give me what we call free cash flow to equity. Okay, so we're going to be dealing with two levels of free cash flow here. First one is free cash flow to the firm, which is the cash flow that's available after meeting growth needs, etc. It's available to pay interest and dividends. Take out the interest, and then you've only got cash flow that's available to pay dividends. So we've got two levels of free cash flow. In a sense, free cash flow of the firm kind of mirrors return on assets, and free cash flow to equity mirrors return on shareholders' equity. They're not the same or anything, but the concepts are kind of analogous. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with our income from operations. Now, for our income from operations, obviously we're going to go up to the income statement here. So we're going to go way up to the income statement, and let's see what we can do here. So we're going to, boy, this is a long thing. We're going to go up to the income statement here. And we're going to start with their income before income taxes and extraordinary items. And what I'm going to do is, because there's an item there called, here called other income. I don't know what that is. I don't even think it's operating income. So what I'm going to do to get basically their operating income, after interest, by the way, at this level, is I'm going to take that income before income tax and extraordinary items. They used to have extraordinary items, by the way. And I'm going to go ahead and add back this other income number there, because to me, that doesn't look like that's even an operating amount. So the number I come to is going to be $3751.40. Okay. Now we're going to add back the interest expense net of taxes. And the reason we're doing that is because our first level of cash flow is free cash flow to the firm, which is available to pay both interest and dividends. If I didn't add this back, I would only have cash flow available to pay dividends. Okay, so, and I'll keep talking about this in a second. So what we're going to do is, and it's relatively small interest expense. I could have used a firm with a lot more interest, but I like, for some reason I like Lily. Okay, so we're going to take the interest expense. Okay, so, and it's not as much as you might think it is. So what we're going to do is we're going to add back the interest expense. So let's go all the way up here to the income statement again. Okay, and interest expense is that amount right there. And we'll fix the pluses and minuses in a second. I'm going to take the interest expense and multiply that times 1 minus my tax rate. Now, I pointed this out earlier. It's really the only number I'm going to use over here. My tax rate is 22%. Okay, so it's those two numbers right there. I'm going to take the interest expense of $79.70 and add back 1 minus my tax rate, which would give me my after-tax interest. And that gives me $62.42, which is, you could say, maybe I'm choosing a immaterial example, but that's just the way it is. Okay, so we're going to add that back. Okay, and so our subtotal here is going to be $37.51 plus $62.42, which is going to give us $38.13. Go ahead, subtotal that here. Okay, and then just to finish this calculation here, is we're going to take the usual suspects in the free cash flow calculation, and they're all going to come from right above from the statement of cash flows. Our increase in working capital, it's already been calculated for you, thank God, in the statement of cash flows. Statement of cash flows, let's go up here, and it happens to be just equal that number right there. You know, it's minus their working capital probably went up by 1,542, just subtracting that out. Then we're going to add back the interest expense. So, and you know the interest expense is going to be, should be a plus up here. The interest amortization is $493. Then the capital expenditures, hopefully they have it here as a minus. Okay, so purchases of property, plant, and equipment. Just seeing if it was minus $1130. So your free cash flow to the firm is going to be basically your pre-interest income minus the increase in your working capital plus your depreciation expense minus your capital expenditures, and so it gives you $1633.82, which is your free cash flow to the firm. Now that's your cash flow. This is available. This is cash available to pay interest and taxes. Okay, and then I'm going to put a subtotal here. There's my subtotal. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and subtract this back out. This is kind of like the capital budgeting examples we did. There's similarities, obviously. Okay, so if I take that out, so if this is my cash available to pay interest and taxes, take out your interest expense net of taxes, and we'll just add these two together. This is called free cash flow to equity, and that means this is the cash. Oh, wait a minute. Let me correct that. Let me correct this. This is the cash available to pay. What am I thinking? Interest and dividends. I have taxes on the brain. Okay, so anyway, and this one here is the cash available to pay only dividends, not interest. Okay, so I will make that. Okay, and this is where I'm going to stop the first video. But keep in mind that we add back the interest. Now, first of all, income from operations. I started with the income, with your basic income, which was 34 something, way up here. Way up here. And I added back that other income because that doesn't look like, it's not an operating item. So those two give me about $3,700 in operating income. I added back the interest expense times 1 minus my tax rate. That subtotal really is sort of income before, it's income before interest, in a sense. That's what it is, because I've already taken out taxes. And it's okay, and so then you've got your working capital, your depreciation expense, and your capital expenditures. That gives you your cash that will pay interest and dividends. That kind of makes sense, because I added back my interest up here. And I only did that, by the way, because of the way these statements are formatted. Sometimes statements will be formatted so you don't have to make that adjustment, because they've got the income statement well constructed. Not in this case. Okay, so, but if I take cash flow, pay interest and dividends, take out the interest, gives me free cash flow and equity. So we'll start with that. But the three, keep in mind, there's three concepts. Concept number one. The value of a firm is only determined, according to these two Nobel Prize winners, I believe, okay, is determined by the value of the assets. The financing mixture does not matter. Number two, it does not matter. But they did ultimately recognize that, even though their argument, I think, is good, that assets and management matter rather than the capital mixture. They do recognize that interest, the tax deductibility of interest, does give firms that are leveraged a bit of an advantage, maybe. Okay. Second concept is that we're going to be using not the constant growth formula here, the no growth formula. The no growth formula is to get the value of the cash flow today, just take cash flow and divide by the cost of capital. Okay. And then finally, final concept here we started is that there's two levels of free cash flow. Free cash flow to the firm, free cash flow to equity. This one's available to pay interest and dividends. This one's available to pay dividends. Okay, so that gets us through our first video. In the next video, I'm going to actually do a valuation 2 or 3 different ways, probably 2. But I'm going to do a valuation based on the assumption that literally doesn't grow. That's what I'm doing in the second video. In the final video, we're going to add growth to it. Throughout this, we will consider the value of, or the argument that was made by the two gentlemen. Anyway, so I'll be putting up this video and then the other 2 videos soon thereafter. I hope everybody is well. Please take care.